Introduction. We are accustomed to the assumption that adults, simply by virtue of having lived longer, possess greater maturity than their children. But what happens when highly sensitive children are born into the world and, within a mere few years, outpace their own parents in emotional depth and maturity? What is the outcome when these profoundly limited parents lack the emotional responsiveness necessary to meet their children's most fundamental psychological needs? The consequence is a very specific kind of emotional neglect, a form of deprivation that is every bit as real and damaging as physical starvation. This silent neglect breeds a profound and enduring emotional loneliness, a pervasive ache that can cast a long shadow over an individual's entire life, ultimately influencing their choices regarding intimate partners and adult relationships. This exploration is dedicated to understanding that specific pain. It illuminates exactly how emotionally immature parents negatively affect their adult children, especially those who are inherently sensitive, and offers a path toward healing from the confusion and suffering caused by parents who fundamentally refuse emotional intimacy. Emotionally immature parents are driven by a deep-seated fear of genuine feeling. They actively pull back from emotional closeness. To navigate life, they deploy primitive coping mechanisms that resist and distort reality rather than engaging with it. Furthermore, they are largely incapable of self-reflection, meaning they rarely accept responsibility, look inward, or offer genuine apologies. Their immaturity renders them inconsistent and emotionally unreliable, making them utterly blind to their children's needs the moment their own internal agendas and anxieties take precedence. As this dynamic unfolds, it becomes starkly clear that when a parent is emotionally immature, a child's legitimate emotional needs will almost inevitably lose out to the parent's raw survival instincts. This painful dynamic is not a modern psychological invention, it is an ancient human struggle. Myths and fairy tales have depicted these perilous parent-child relationships for centuries. Consider the countless stories of abandoned children forced to seek guidance from woodland animals or other helpers because their own parents were careless, clueless, or completely absent. In some narratives, the parent character is actively malevolent, leaving the children to take their survival entirely into their own hands. These stories have resonated deeply across generations precisely because they strike a universal chord. The terrifying reality of a child forced to fend for themselves after being neglected or abandoned by their protectors. This theme of emotional starvation at the hands of self-preoccupied parents continues to permeate our modern popular culture. In books, movies, and television, the profound impact of emotionally immature parents on their children's lives remains a rich and compelling subject. By giving a name to this phenomenon, by understanding the specific mechanics of emotional maturity, you are handed a powerful lens through which to view your own life. It provides an explanation for why you may have felt profoundly isolated even when surrounded by people claiming love and kinship. It answers the agonizing questions of why interactions with certain family members have always felt so uniquely hurtful and frustrating. The liberating news is that by comprehending the concept of emotional immaturity, you can begin to calibrate your expectations to reality. You can learn to accept the exact level of relationship that is actually possible with these individuals, rather than being continually shattered by their inability to respond to you. Psychotherapists have long known that emotionally disengaging from toxic parents is the critical first step toward restoring inner peace and achieving self-sufficiency. But the lingering question has always been, how do we actually do this? We accomplish it by seeing clearly what we are dealing with. What has often been entirely missing from the literature on self-involved parents is a complete explanation of why there are such rigid limits on their capacity to love. This exploration bridges that exact gap, explaining that these individuals fundamentally lack emotional maturity. Once you recognize their specific traits, you will be fully equipped to judge for yourself what level of relationship can or cannot be salvaged with your parent. This knowledge is the key that unlocks the door back to yourself. It allows you to stop focusing on parents who stubbornly refuse to change, and instead begin living authentically from your own deeper nature. Understanding that their neglect was never a statement about you, but rather a reflection of them, frees you from emotional loneliness. When you truly see why they cannot be different, you can finally be free of the crippling frustration they cause, as well as the haunting doubts about your own lovability. The goal of this journey is profound relief from the confusion and emotional suffering that immature parents arouse in their children. If understanding these concepts helps you see yourself as a thoroughly worthy person who is no longer held hostage at the mercy of other people's manipulations, then the healing has already begun. Given the profound anguish associated with emotional deprivation during early development, one might wonder why adults so frequently find themselves trapped in similarly unfulfilling partnerships later in life. The answer lies in the primitive structures of the human brain which equate familiarity with safety. We are naturally drawn toward dynamics we have already navigated because we possess the ingrained survival skills to endure them. During our formative years, acknowledging our caregivers' profound flaws is a terrifying prospect, so we blind ourselves to their limitations to maintain a sense of security. Tragically, this childhood mechanism of denial impairs our adult ability to spot the warning signs of emotional unavailability in prospective partners. By refusing to face the painful reality of our early environment, we condemn ourselves to cyclical reenactments, entirely oblivious to the approaching heartbreak until it is already upon us. Consider the experience of a dedicated nurse who spent 5 years in a relationship with a man who continually evaded deeper commitment. While her partner was content with their superficial dynamic, he routinely shut down whenever she attempted to initiate meaningful emotional dialogue. Approaching her mid-30s, she wrestled with intense frustration and a ticking biological clock, yet she simultaneously chastised herself for supposedly demanding too much. Her breaking point arrived during a nostalgic dinner at the site of their first date, where her partner's behavior strongly hinted at a marriage proposal. Instead of a ring, he presented her with a mocking note featuring a question mark, a cruel prank designed to trivialize her desires. Seeking solace, she confided in her mother, only to be utterly invalidated when her mother sided with the boyfriend and dismissed her legitimate outrage. This demeaning incident illuminated a harsh truth. Her mother and her partner shared a profound insensitivity to the inner lives of others. Through introspection, she recognized that her romantic relationship was merely an extension of the emotional desolation she had endured since childhood. She had simply traded one dismissive figure for another. It is particularly heartbreaking to observe highly functional individuals who appear to have achieved every hallmark of success yet remain plagued by an inexplicable misery. These individuals are the classic victims of childhoods where physical requirements were adequately met but emotional sustenance was entirely withheld. They often feel a profound sense of guilt for their internal dissatisfaction, mentally tallying their material blessings as if gratitude could mathematically cancel out emotional starvation. Despite their outward achievements, an unshakable isolation haunts them, leaving them starved for authentic intimacy in their primary bonds. Frequently, this desperation drives them to the brink of separation, or pushes them into clandestine affairs just to experience a flicker of the connection they lack. Others abandon the pursuit of romance entirely, viewing emotional devotion as an inevitable snare. Even those who remain in barren marriages for the sake of their offspring often seek professional guidance simply to manage their simmering resentment. Rarely do they recognize that the root of their current despair was planted in their earliest familial bonds. Instead, they berate themselves for their supposed selfishness, assuming that all relationships are inherently exhausting and devoid of true reciprocity. While enduring partnerships undeniably require patience, the fundamental act of being seen and valued should never feel like an insurmountable chore. Although societal narratives frequently suggest that men require less emotional sustenance than women, the devastating statistics surrounding male violence and suicide sharply contradict this myth. Men who are deprived of genuine companionship and tender attention experience the exact same hollow despair as anyone else, even if they have been conditioned to conceal it. The necessity for deep interpersonal bonds is a universal human imperative, entirely independent of gender. When children realize they cannot engage their caregivers authentically, they often adopt artificial personas, desperately hoping to perform their way into their parents' affections. Yet, this theatrical compliance yields only shallow approval, never the profound closeness they seek. Caregivers lacking the capacity for empathy do not miraculously acquire it simply because a child behaves perfectly. Consequently, adults who survived such deprivation, regardless of whether they are male or female, frequently struggle to accept that they are worthy of love just for existing. They remain convinced that affection must be purchased through relentless self-sacrifice, and the flawless execution of a subservient role. This dynamic was starkly evident in the life of a newlywed man who, despite marrying a deeply affectionate and supportive woman, found himself sinking into an unexplainable depression. He confessed that he felt like a fraud, constantly exhausting himself by feigning an exaggerated cheerfulness to match his wife's joyful disposition. He operated under the deeply ingrained assumption that his sole purpose was to artificially elevate his partner's mood, believing that absolute compliance was the mandatory price of admission for a relationship. Terrified that revealing his true exhaustion would provoke fury and devastation, he projected the tyrannical traits of his volatile, demanding mother onto his loving wife. The mere suggestion that he possessed legitimate emotional needs triggered profound shame. His childhood had taught him that vulnerability was synonymous with pathetic weakness. As he gradually permitted himself to be authentic within his safe marriage, he was shocked by the volcanic rage that surfaced toward his mother. He had yet to understand that intense hatred is the natural, biological defense mechanism against psychological subjugation, a screaming alarm that someone is extinguishing your life force for their own convenience. The suffocating weight of emotional isolation is not confined to romantic entanglements. It frequently manifests in agonizing, lifelong obligations to the parents themselves. Many adults find their parental relationships so thoroughly parasitic that they possess neither the energy nor the desire to pursue independent romantic lives. For these individuals, the very concept of connection is synonymous with being simultaneously abandoned and enslaved. They view intimacy as a prison, their lives already entirely consumed by a caregiver who claims absolute ownership over their existence. One such individual, a young educator, found her autonomy entirely crushed by a domineering mother who demanded cohabitation and full-time caregiving. The relentless pressure drove the daughter to the brink of self-destruction. When she finally summoned the courage to declare her independence, an act her counselor deemed essential for her actual survival, her mother callously attempted to weaponize guilt, insisting the daughter would ruin her own life and that the mother could not survive without her. By pushing through this manipulative resistance, the daughter discovered that enduring temporary guilt was an infinitely small price to secure her own emancipation. Caregivers lacking emotional maturity systematically fail to mirror or validate a child's intuitive reality. Bereft of this crucial affirmation, children learn to suppress their own compass, yielding instead to the loudest, most confident voices in the room. As adults, this self-doubt becomes paralyzing, leading them to tolerate deeply unfulfilling partnerships simply because they lack the conviction to trust their own misery. They shoulder the entirety of the blame for the relationship's failure, convincing themselves that perpetual, grinding struggle is the normal state of human bonding. In reality, when two individuals are genuinely aligned and emotionally responsive, connection is a source of joy, not a relentless labor. It is not an extravagant demand to expect comfort and happiness in the presence of a partner. The cultural adage that one cannot have everything is frequently utilized as a shield to justify emotional starvation. Every human being possesses the innate capacity to recognize when they are being genuinely nourished. We are not creatures of infinite, unreasonable greed. When the soul senses a void, that intuition is profoundly accurate. Yet, those raised to ignore their inner warnings will survey their functional lives, their homes, their incomes, their physical safety, and ruthlessly condemn themselves for daring to want more. This internalized self-betrayal often leads to monumental life errors, such as the case of a young woman who, despite deep misgivings, succumbed to familial pressure and married a wealthy man she had previously broken up with multiple times. Decades later, with her children grown, her desperate desire to escape the marriage was met with bewildered hostility from both her husband and her parents. Because her grievances were purely emotional, a lack of mutual joy, a profound absence of being heard, and a complete deficit of compatibility, her family treated her complaints as fundamentally invalid. The tragedy was not her inability to articulate her pain, but rather her family's militant refusal to acknowledge anything that disrupted their practical comfort. She was suffocated by the accusation that her longing for actual connection was a selfish violation of her vows. Yet vows are merely words. The true lifeblood of any union is the mutual delight of intimate understanding. Society is quick to brand those who flee barren marriages as impulsive or immoral, demanding they endure just a little more. But this ignores the reality of total energetic bankruptcy. This woman had exhausted decades trying to placate a spouse and parents who countered her desperate letters and pleas with egocentric demands for her compliance. When she finally anchored herself in her own truth, she articulated the most basic human right, the desire to be cherished and chosen. Her lifelong conditioning had made her question if wanting to feel special was an arrogant demand, a toxic lie constantly reinforced by a husband who weaponized her needs against her. When the foundation of childhood is built upon rejection, the resulting adult anticipates nothing but indifference from the wider world. They operate under the crushing assumption that they are inherently uninteresting and burdensome. Convinced that expressing a need is an act of offensive intrusion, they preemptively silence themselves. This tragic anticipation of abandonment creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, ensuring their continued isolation. The journey to healing requires exposing this instilled damage while simultaneously cultivating the courage to risk authentic connection. The capacity for interaction remains intact. It is merely buried beneath a lifetime of expecting the worst. Consider a man plagued by chronic anxiety, raised by an imperious mother who treated him as an insignificant afterthought. He was conditioned to view himself as the lowest priority in any room. Even after marrying an exceptionally warm and loving woman, he remained utterly bewildered by her affection, viewing himself as an entirely forgettable entity. His mother's disdain had forged a conviction that his inner turmoil was repulsive. When engulfed by depression, he actively hid his suffering from his supportive wife, terrified she would view him as a pathetic burden. He consciously accepted her love, but subconsciously believed he was required to process his anguish in total isolation, viewing self-reliance as a mandatory virtue rather than an emotional prison. This pervasive self-doubt also sabotages joy, as seen in a successful journalist who finally won a prestigious writing contest. Instead of celebration, the victory unleashed a torrent of childhood trauma, recalling a history of parents who systematically mocked her ambitions to ensure she never outshone them. In the exact moment of her triumph, she was paralyzed by the agonizing expectation that someone would emerge to humiliate her and strip away her accomplishment. She concealed her success entirely, convinced the world shared her parents' cruel apathy. It is a profound paradox that individuals who endured severe emotional starvation can still forge highly functional, outwardly brilliant lives. They build careers, nurture families, and cultivate robust social circles. Yet, the architectural stability of their present cannot entirely erase the seismic fault lines of their past. The ghosts of early abandonment frequently re-emerge through the subconscious avenues of dread, depression, and haunting nightmares. A highly esteemed business consultant provides a striking example. Despite her impeccable exterior, her nights were plagued by recurring terrors of being trapped in desperate, inescapable scenarios where she alone bore the responsibility for survival, surrounded by passive onlookers who offered no aid or comfort. This nocturnal torment was a flawless metaphor for the core reality of the emotionally neglected child, standing utterly alone in the presence of caregivers who provide no sanctuary. In her waking life, she continued to care for an elderly mother who responded to her devotion only with relentless accusations of inadequacy. Since infancy, she had borne the crushing weight of her mother's psychological stability while receiving absolutely nothing in return. Children forced into this premature adulthood learn to mimic total self-sufficiency, grasping desperately at any meager sign of attachment. Behind the armor of her corporate success and profound emotional intelligence lay a terrified child, bracing for the inevitable return of total isolation. It was not until midlife that she finally connected the pervasive dread in her dreams to the bottomless void of her mother's neglect. The agony of isolation is not merely a psychological quirk. It is a fundamental biological alarm. From an evolutionary standpoint, physical proximity and emotional integration with the group dictated survival. Those who craved connection lived, those indifferent to the herd perished. When we ache for understanding, we are not displaying weakness. We are echoing the primal genetic code of our species. The terror of loneliness is woven into the very fabric of human antiquity. The absence of authentic emotional exchange breeds a specific and devastating loneliness that echoes from the nursery into adulthood. While reliable, attuned engagement forms the bedrock of human security, caregivers frightened by depth cannot provide this essential anchoring. The resulting trauma warps future attachments, leading adults to reenact familiar deprivations while shouldering the blame for their own misery. Professional and social victories cannot override the foundational wounds of early disconnection. The path forward requires a stark, unflinching comprehension of how a caregiver's arrested development shaped our own relational blueprints. By illuminating the exact mechanisms of this immaturity, we begin the process of untangling ourselves from the past. Chapter 2. Recognizing the emotionally immature parent. Examining the fundamental nature of our earliest caregivers can evoke a sense of disloyalty, as if clarity itself were a betrayal. Yet the objective here is not to assign blame or orchestrate a betrayal, but rather to achieve a dispassionate, objective understanding of the underlying emotional framework that shaped our beginnings. Much of the hurtful behavior exhibited by limited caregivers is not born of conscious malice, but rather operates entirely outside their awareness. By viewing these limitations through a more detached lens, we gain profound insights into our own histories, unlocking a new level of self-awareness and emotional freedom. Armed with the independence of adulthood, we can finally evaluate whether our caregivers were truly capable of providing the nuanced understanding we required. By recognizing their deeper emotional mechanics, we safeguard ourselves against the shock of their limitations. This private process of observation cannot harm them, but it holds the power to restore our own self-confidence and anchor us in the truth of our own stories. When reflecting upon the past to gauge this immaturity, distinct patterns begin to emerge. We might recall a caregiver who routinely escalated minor inconveniences into catastrophic events, or one who visibly recoiled from the vulnerability of emotional closeness. Conversations may have felt entirely one-sided, revolving exclusively around their passing interests, while our own triumphs were met with deflation or indifference. They might have utilized us as a captive audience for their grievances while offering zero reciprocal comfort. Logic and differing perspectives were likely perceived as personal attacks, sparking intense defensiveness, while any attempt to discuss the relationship itself was met with a stark refusal to engage in self-reflection. It is crucial to distinguish between a structural personality pattern and a temporary emotional regression. Under extreme stress or exhaustion, any human being can momentarily lose their equilibrium and act impulsively. However, mature individuals eventually experience a pang of regret, a cringe factor that prompts them to reflect on their impact and offer apologies. For those locked in a pattern of emotional immaturity, their defensive and reactive behaviors are entirely automatic. Because they do not step back to evaluate the consequences of their actions on others, they rarely experience genuine regret or offer sincere apologies. To fully grasp this deficit, one must first understand the architecture of true emotional maturity, a state that has been rigorously studied. A mature individual possesses the dual capacity to think objectively, while simultaneously sustaining deep, vulnerable connections with others. They navigate life with a well-developed, cohesive sense of identity, allowing them to function independently without sacrificing their closest attachments. They are direct in their pursuits, yet their emotional intelligence and impulse control ensure they do not exploit those around them. When conflicts arise, they address differences directly to restore harmony, utilizing humor, empathy, and foresight to navigate stress. Because they are fundamentally comfortable with themselves, they can easily admit their own weaknesses and enjoy the richness of opening up to the inner lives of others. In stark contrast, those arrested in their emotional development exhibit an interconnected web of rigid mental and behavioral traits. Provided life follows a predictable, highly structured path, they can function adequately, sometimes even achieving significant professional prestige. However, the moment they encounter emotional complexity or relationship demands, their severe limitations become glaringly apparent. They approach reality by attempting to forcefully narrow it down to something they can easily control. In their minds, there is only one correct answer, rendering them intensely defensive and entirely devoid of humor when confronted with differing perspectives. This rigidity is born of an exceptionally low tolerance for stress. Instead of assessing challenges objectively, they rely on primitive coping mechanisms that actively distort or deny reality. Confronted with their own errors, they instinctively discount facts and project blame onto anyone else. Because regulating their internal state is an insurmountable task, They frequently overreact and then demand that the external world, usually their family, soothe them by yielding to their exact preferences. While maturation generally teaches us that immediate gratification is not always the wisest course, the emotionally immature remain captive to their childhood instinct to simply do whatever feels best in the moment. They habitually follow the path of least resistance. Consider the profound avoidance displayed by a grown man, Tom, who accompanied his sister to discuss assisted living arrangements with their elderly father. Just as the crucial conversation was about to begin, Tom vanished, fleeing the house and driving away rather than facing the discomfort. To a mature mind, this level of avoidance is staggering, but for someone governed entirely by immediate emotional relief, escaping the tension simply felt better than enduring it. This reliance on feeling dictates that their entire worldview is subjective rather than objective. When interpreting an event, their internal emotional state entirely overrides the actual, verifiable facts of the situation. Attempting to introduce logic, historical accuracy, or rational analysis into a disagreement with them is utterly futile because, to their minds, what feels true is the only reality that matters. Consequently, they view individuality and differing opinions not as natural human variations, but as deep personal annoyances. They firmly believe that everyone should share their exact worldview. This profound blindness to the distinct boundaries of others frequently leads them to commit jarring social offenses. While young children are naturally egocentric due to their developing brains, the self-involvement of an immature adult is devoid of any joyful innocence. Their self-obsession is driven by a hidden chronic insecurity, a terrifying unspoken fear that they are fundamentally inadequate or unlovable. To protect this fragile core, they construct impenetrable defenses to keep others at a safe distance. These defenses operate so seamlessly that the individuals themselves are entirely unaware of their own underlying terror, because they must constantly monitor their environment to ensure their needs are prioritized. The feelings of everyone around them are completely eclipsed. For example, when a daughter finally expressed the pain she felt listening to her mother constantly berate her father, the mother simply retorted that without her daughter to complain to, she would have no one. The daughter's pain was irrelevant compared to the mother's need to vent. In conversation, they are relentlessly self-referential, instantly hijacking any topic to return the spotlight to their own experiences. A daughter seeking comfort during a painful divorce will quickly find herself listening to her mother's recounting of her own past marital strife. They possess an uncanny ability to upstage their children's greatest victories by suddenly reminiscing about their own past achievements. Even when they politely feign listening, their lack of genuine curiosity is palpable. They ask no probing questions and swiftly terminate the discussion with superficial pleasantries. Because their focus is entirely on maintaining their self-image, rather than achieving insight, they never question their own motives or consider their role in interpersonal conflicts. This intense need to be the focal point often results in them dominating the energy of any room. Unlike true extroverts, who thrive on reciprocal exchange and enthusiastically welcome the participation of others, the immature individual talks as a means of shutting everyone else down. Within the family structure, this demands a toxic role reversal, wherein the child is forced to provide the attentiveness, soothing, and unconditional admiration normally expected of the parent. A stark illustration of this occurred when an 8-year-old girl left to care for her severely depressed, abandoned mother was forced to act thrilled when her father arrived in a brand new convertible to flaunt his exciting new life, entirely oblivious to the devastation he had left behind. In an even more extreme case, a physically abusive father named Martin, who routinely beat his children, still demanded that his eldest daughter, Frida, supply him with maternal adoration. He would shower her with grandiose, unwanted gestures, such as overtaking her small deck with a massive homemade porch swing, expecting her to mirror his own childish pride, completely ignoring the reality of the fear and space he was violating. At the core of this behavior is a profound impairment in resonant empathy. True empathy is not merely a cognitive exercise in reading a room. It requires the mental flexibility to imagine that other people possess completely separate minds, intentions, and emotional landscapes. While emotionally immature people can often be highly cunning in detecting another person's vulnerabilities or intentions, they use this data instinctively to manage their own environment, not to foster deep connection. Because they have never developed the capacity to explore their own deep emotions, it is physically impossible for them to resonate with the internal emotional states of their children. The prevalence of this developmental arrest often traces back to the generational transmission of trauma and the harsh, punitive child-rearing practices of the past. Many of these parents grew up in environments saturated with substance abuse, profound loss, or an overarching mandate that children should be seen and not heard, where physical discipline was utilized to enforce rigid obedience. They were systematically shut down, their true personalities pruned back like stunted bonsai trees forced to grow in unnatural, constricted shapes. Consider Ellie's mother, Trudy, a woman lauded for her public charity, who callously gave away her daughter's beloved comfort toy and cherished cat with zero regard for the child's ensuing devastation, explicitly stating later that they only cared about keeping a roof over her head, not her feelings. Or Sarah's mother, who maintained an impenetrable emotional wall while her daughter was awake, only allowing herself to look fondly upon the child when she believed Sarah was safely asleep. Because they were forced to sequester unacceptable parts of themselves to survive their own childhoods, their adult personalities formed in isolated, disjointed clusters, rather than integrating into a cohesive whole. This fragmentation renders them terrifyingly inconsistent. They can pivot from engaged warmth to icy detachment without any awareness of the whiplash they are causing. For a child like Elizabeth, navigating this meant becoming a hyper-vigilant reader of her mother's erratic moods, constantly walking on eggshells. When her mother unpredictably pushed her away, Elizabeth naturally concluded that she herself was fundamentally flawed, shouldering the blame for a chaos she could not control. The intermittent, unpredictable moments of positive connection only serve to bind the child more desperately to the parent, trapped in a cycle of seeking a reward that might never materialize. Over time, the defensive mechanisms they utilized to survive take the place of an authentic self. Desperate children often cling to the fantasy that a real, loving parent is trapped beneath these defenses, waiting to be rescued. Yet when a daughter named Hannah gently invited her stern mother to share something deeply personal, the mother did not blossom. She froze like a deer in headlights and dissolved into overwhelmed tears. The daughter's innocent bid for intimacy had pierced directly into the mother's unresolved, lifetime reservoir of sorrow, instantly overwhelming the rigid defenses she required to function. There is a profound paradox at the heart of the emotionally immature personality. Despite being intensely reactive, they harbor a deep terror of authentic emotion. This contradiction often stems from a childhood environment that failed to guide them through emotional processing or actively punished them for displaying distress. For them, the safest route is to evade feelings entirely or to recover from them as rapidly as possible. The realm of profound emotional depth feels fraught with peril. During their formative years, many of these individuals absorbed the lesson that spontaneous emotional expression was a shameful violation of family norms. Experiencing or revealing their deepest feelings carried the threat of humiliation or punitive measures, resulting in a psychological condition known as affect phobia. By learning to associate their most intimate emotions with being fundamentally bad, they lost the ability to tolerate certain feelings, particularly those vital for true emotional closeness. Consequently, they devoted their energy to constructing rigid defenses against their natural impulses. As adults, the prospect of deep emotional connection triggers an automatic anxiety response. Genuine feeling leaves them feeling stripped and acutely vulnerable. To shield themselves from this perceived danger, they adhere strictly to predictable social scripts and actively resist processing emotions within their relationships. Tragically, when they become parents, they transmit this emotional phobia to the next generation. In these households, a weeping child is often met with threats rather than comfort, instilling a fear that if the tears begin, they might never cease. Because their parents intervene to crush their distress, these children are robbed of the opportunity to experience the natural, self-regulating arc of crying. This environment breeds a fear not only of sorrow, but also of joy. Consider a young boy who, overflowing with excitement, rushed to greet his returning father, accidentally knocking over a small plant in his exuberance. Rather than embracing the child's joyous affection, the father responded with a severe beating. The lesson was brutal and clear. Spontaneous joy was a dangerous emotion that invited punishment. While these caregivers fail spectacularly in the emotional realm, they often excel at tending to their children's physical and material requirements. They can be exceptional providers of food, shelter, and educational opportunities, ensuring their children lack no tangible advantage. Yet regarding the inner life, they remain entirely oblivious. Many adults raised in these environments recall receiving warmth and attention only when they were verifiably ill. Sickness became the sole gateway to parental affection, likely because caretaking for a physical ailment felt justified and safe to the emotionally restricted parent, unlike the terrifying prospect of pure emotional attachment. This discrepancy leaves the grown child profoundly confused, possessing undeniable proof of their parents' material sacrifice, while simultaneously aching from a vast, unfulfilled need for emotional security and closeness. This terror of genuine feeling frequently transforms these parents into chronic killjoys. Rather than sharing in a child's excitement, they instinctively attempt to dampen it, perhaps by abruptly shifting the conversation or issuing warnings against getting overly hopeful. When a daughter eagerly shared her joy over purchasing her first home, her mother's dismissive response was merely to predict that she would soon find something else to obsess over, effectively neutralizing the joyous moment. Because deep emotion is so overwhelming to them, immature individuals process their unease by transmuting it into rapid, superficial reactivity. They may appear highly passionate, easily brought to tears by sentimentality, or quick to inflate with anger over minor slights. However, this emotional display has a glancing, skipping quality, never penetrating the depths of true feeling. It is a theatrical but shallow reaction of the moment. Engaging with them during these episodes often leaves others feeling curiously detached. Despite recognizing that they should feel sympathy, the exaggerated, hollow nature of the outburst prevents true empathic resonance. Over time, others naturally learn to tune out these frequent overreactions simply to preserve their own emotional stability. The capacity to hold mixed emotions, such as blending joy with guilt or anger with love, is a hallmark of psychological maturity, allowing a person to navigate the inherent complexities of human existence. When opposing feelings are experienced simultaneously, they temper one another, creating a richer, more nuanced worldview. Emotionally arrested individuals, however, are confined to black and white, one-dimensional reactions. Their psychological framework simply cannot support the weight of ambivalence or complex emotional dilemmas. Beyond their emotional deficits, these individuals also display distinct intellectual limitations, often rooted in the anxious, judgmental environments of their own childhoods, which discouraged complex, independent thought. Normally, as children reach adolescence, their cognitive abilities expand into conceptual thinking, allowing them to use logic and imagination to evaluate ideas rather than just reacting impulsively. This developmental leap brings the crucial ability to self-reflect, to think about one's own thinking. Yet, for the emotionally immature, intense anxiety disrupts this higher-level cognition. When confronted with emotionally charged subjects, their thinking regresses into rigid absolutes, rejecting any cross-pollination of ideas. While they may demonstrate high intelligence and conceptual ability in non-threatening professional spheres, their intellectual objectivity collapses the moment they feel emotionally vulnerable. This stark duality is incredibly bewildering to their children, who must navigate a parent who is brilliant one moment and entirely unreasonable the next. Their communication style further reflects this limitation, remaining heavily anchored in the literal and the routine. Conversations consist of recounting observed facts and daily occurrences, actively avoiding the realms of abstract ideas or deep feelings. A son might find conversations with his mother agonizingly dull because she only reports on the weather or mundane daily tasks, completely incapable of engaging in discussions that carry genuine emotional weight or personal meaning. Conversely, some manifest their immaturity by obsessively intellectualizing specific topics. They can discuss their favored subjects at exhausting length, but this conceptualization is utilized as a shield against true intimacy. The conversation remains entirely impersonal, focusing solely on ideas while effectively ignoring the human being sitting across from them. Ultimately, this phenomenon of arrested emotional development severely compromises an individual's capacity to manage stress and cultivate intimate bonds. Raised in environments that stunted their full psychological growth, they navigate life using an oversimplified, rigid blueprint. their lack of a cohesive self breeds a profound egocentrism that blinds them to the inner lives of others. Driven by reactive emotions, a lack of objective reasoning, and a profound terror of intimacy, they create an incredibly challenging landscape for those attempting to forge close relationships with them, especially their own children. Chapter 4. 4 Types of Emotionally Immature Parents. While the fundamental expression of nurturing love remains remarkably consistent across humanity, the avenues through which a caregiver can frustrate a child's psychological development are tragically diverse. Emotionally arrested caregivers manifest their limitations in various distinct styles, yet all of them ultimately inflict a profound sense of insecurity and isolation upon their offspring. Despite the stark behavioral differences that separate these parenting styles on the surface, the underlying architectural flaw remains identical. At their core, these individuals are bound by a pervasive egocentrism, a severe deficit in empathic resonance, and an entrenched unreliability. They consistently deploy primitive psychological defenses that warp reality to suit their comfort, rather than adapting to the actual needs of their environment. By utilizing their offspring to regulate their own internal anxieties, they frequently instigate a toxic role reversal, burdening the young with adult emotional weight. They actively resist acknowledging their children as autonomous beings with sovereign internal lives, choosing instead to view them merely as extensions of their own immediate desires. This relentless self-preoccupation guarantees that the child's authentic identity is continually eclipsed by the overwhelming demands of the caregiver. To fully grasp the mechanics of this deprivation, it is highly illuminating to examine foundational psychological research regarding the earliest bonds forged between mother and infant. Pioneering observational studies conducted in the early 1970s scrutinized how specific maternal behaviors directly influenced whether a baby developed a secure or insecure attachment. Researchers meticulously evaluated mothers across several dimensions, primarily focusing on their sensitivity versus insensitivity to their child's signals. The findings were stark and undeniable. A caregiver's capacity for sensitivity was the absolute linchpin of healthy development. Mothers who consistently tuned into their infants' subtle communications, accurately interpreting their moods and responding with genuine empathy, invariably raised securely attached children. Their interventions were beautifully timed and appropriate, providing exactly what the infant required. Conversely, the behaviors exhibited by insensitive mothers paint a chilling portrait of emotional immaturity. These caregivers frequently fail to notice their child's psychological state, either actively ignoring the baby or entirely missing nuanced cues of distress. Even when they did register their infant's behavior, they lacked the empathic capacity to understand it, often distorting the child's needs through the lens of their own projections. Because they could not mentally resonate with the infant, their responses were jarringly inappropriate, poorly timed, fragmented, and emotionally unresolved. This inability to synchronize with a child's moment-to-moment reality establishes the foundational blueprint for a lifelong relational disconnect. Building upon these early developmental insights, we can identify 4 primary manifestations of the emotionally immature parent. While each type undermines a child's foundation in a unique manner, they are all united by an absolute failure to provide reliable emotional sanctuary. It is also crucial to recognize that these profiles exist along a continuum of severity. At the most extreme end, these behaviors cross into the territory of severe psychological pathology or active abuse, while milder forms might simply manifest as chronic emotional blindness. Furthermore, while most caregivers default to one primary style, severe stress can cause them to temporarily exhibit the destructive traits of another category. The first of these categories is the emotional parent. This type is perhaps the most obviously infantile, exuding an aura of extreme fragility that demands constant vigilance from the rest of the family. They are governed entirely by their fluctuating moods, swinging wildly from suffocating over-involvement to icy abrupt withdrawal. The slightest inconvenience is catastrophized into an apocalyptic crisis, and when they inevitably emotionally disintegrate, they drag their entire household down into the abyss with them. Their children are forced to endure the full, terrifying brunt of their despair or rage, learning very early to walk on eggshells to avoid triggering the next explosion. At the severe end of the spectrum, this volatility is symptomatic of serious mental illness, potentially involving psychotic breaks or profound personality disorders where rage can escalate into physical violence or terrifying threats of self-harm. The crushing burden of trying to keep an unstable parent alive and calm fundamentally traumatizes a child. Even in milder forms, where the parent merely cycles through dramatic highs and lows, their absolute reliance on emotional manipulation creates an intimidating, unreliable environment. They view themselves as perpetual victims, yet their unchecked impulsivity tyrannically dictates the entire family's reality. Children raised in this crucible frequently learn to entirely subjugate their own needs, developing a hyper-attunement to the shifting emotional weather of others simply to survive. The suffocating nature of this dynamic is perfectly illustrated by the experience of a grown woman who, despite living entirely independently, found herself relentlessly pursued by her mother's unmanaged anxiety. When the daughter fell ill and requested a few days of quiet rest, her mother's internal tension spiked intolerably. Unable to self-soothe, the mother relentlessly phoned her daughter and ultimately appeared at her home, demanding access. When the daughter protected her boundaries by locking the screen door, the mother erupted into a furious rage, later admitting she had wanted to break the door down. When gently confronted about this severe intrusion, the mother immediately retreated into the victim role, justifying her aggression by claiming she simply needed the reassurance of seeing her child. The daughter's actual physical need for rest was completely annihilated by the mother's desperate, consuming need to alleviate her own panic. The second category is the driven parent. To the outside world, this individual often appears exceptionally normal, highly responsible, and intensely invested in their child's future. They are perpetually in motion, compulsively goal-oriented, and ruthlessly dedicated to perfecting everything and everyone in their orbit. However, this relentless pursuit of achievement masks a profound egocentrism and a startling deficit of empathy. They operate under the unshakable, arrogant assumption that they possess the absolute truth regarding what is best for others. Seldom pausing to evaluate their own motivations, they systematically ignore their children's unique aptitudes, choosing instead to selectively praise only the behaviors that align with their rigid expectations. Their interference is ceaseless, and their focus on tangible success entirely eclipses the emotional landscape of the home. Frequently having survived their own emotionally barren childhoods through sheer willpower and self-reliance, they are terrified that their offspring will humiliate them through failure. Consequently, they subject their children to a state of perpetual evaluation, offering conditional guidance that feels more like a relentless critique than loving support. This suffocating oversight often destroys the child's natural initiative, ironically transforming the offspring of a highly motivated parent into a depressed, unmotivated adult who fundamentally distrusts their own inner compass. Consider a young man who, despite reaching his early 20s, felt utterly devoid of ownership over his own existence. He lived perpetually on his mother's radar, crushed beneath the weight of his parents' suffocating expectations. The pressure to conform to their vision of success was so absolute that he had entirely lost access to his own desires. Even family vacations were fraught with peril. If he failed to project the exact level of joyful enthusiasm his father demanded, he was met with furious resentment. Terrified that establishing any personal goals would simply invite further microscopic control, he paralyzed himself, his natural initiative completely extinguished by parents who were completely deaf to his need for autonomy. A similarly destructive manifestation of the driven parent is seen in the life of a highly successful attorney who spent her childhood terrorized by a father who demanded absolute intellectual conformity. Any deviation from his worldview was met with swift, furious invalidation. His method of instruction completely lacked empathic foresight. He famously attempted to teach her to swim by simply dropping her into the deep end of a pool. He offered zero compassionate guidance, relying entirely on terrifying ultimatums demanding excellence. While she outwardly achieved the success he commanded, her internal world was a landscape of chronic fear and haunting insecurity, convinced she was merely performing a hollow masquerade of competence. The third category is the passive parent. While they lack the overt aggression or suffocating control of the other types, their insidious avoidance inflicts its own unique devastation. These individuals possess a laissez-faire mentality, actively fleeing from any scenario that requires them to manage conflict or distress. They happily surrender authority to a more dominant, often abusive partner, chronically minimizing severe household dysfunction. Because they are often playful, easygoing, and capable of sporadic warmth, they are frequently the favored caregiver. However, they frequently exploit this bond, utilizing the child to satisfy their own need for an admiring, uncomplicated companion, a dynamic that borders on emotional incest. While the child desperately cherishes these moments of connection, they instinctively recognize that this parent lacks the fortitude to actually protect them. In the face of genuine crisis or abuse from the dominant partner, the passive parent simply dissociates, retreating into a psychological fog and leaving the child entirely defenseless. Furthermore, because their primary allegiance is to their own comfort, they are highly prone to abandoning the family altogether if an easier, more pleasant life presents itself elsewhere. The children left behind frequently dedicate their adulthoods to rationalizing this agonizing betrayal, struggling to accept that the nice parent fundamentally failed in their sacred duty to provide protection. The profound betrayal inherent in this passivity is vividly demonstrated in the life of a woman raised by a violently explosive mother and a gentle, affectionate father. Her father's workshop was the only sanctuary in her terrified existence, and she worshipped his mild demeanor. Yet when her mother subjected her to brutal physical beatings in the next room, her father's only intervention was to loudly rattle pots in the kitchen, a pathetic, cowardly signal that he was nearby but entirely unwilling to intervene. Even when older siblings mercilessly mocked her speech impediment to the point of hysteria, her father merely chuckled, choosing the path of least resistance over defending his daughter's dignity. The final category is the rejecting parent. These individuals exist behind an impenetrable psychological fortress. They exhibit zero desire for familial intimacy and project an aura of profound irritation at the mere existence of their offspring. Their fundamental tolerance for the needs of others is practically non-existent. Their interactions are generally limited to barking commands, sudden explosions of rage, or aggressively isolating themselves from the household. They employ a chilling lack of eye contact or a hostile, vacant stare to actively repel any attempts at connection. The family quickly learns that the home revolves entirely around avoiding the parent's displeasure. In milder cases, they may endure superficial family rituals, but their absolute emotional detachment remains palpable. Children raised in this frozen environment inevitably internalize the belief that they are inherently bothersome, a nuisance merely for drawing breath. They rapidly abandon the natural instinct to seek comfort, learning to preemptively silence their own needs to avoid provoking the parent's contempt. This freezing rejection was the daily reality for a daughter whose mother actively physically recoiled from embraces. The mother's immediate instinct upon her daughter's arrival was to find a superficial flaw to criticize, quickly followed by demanding the daughter telephone a distant relative, anything to divert the pressure of actual interpersonal contact. Telephone conversations were similarly barren, with the mother seizing the first available excuse to terminate the call or hand the receiver to someone else. Her message was unwavering. Genuine connection was an intolerable burden. As one absorbs these four distinct profiles, it becomes a crucial exercise to mentally evaluate the figures of one's own childhood. By objectively reflecting upon a caregiver's historical behavior, whether they were prone to theatrical overreactions, driven by an obsessive need to control, defined by their cowardly avoidance of conflict, or insulated by a wall of hostile rejection, one begins to dismantle the confusing facade of the past. These specific traits, from a terrifying emotional intensity to an absolute refusal to engage in relationship repair, are the undeniable hallmarks of arrested development. Ultimately, whether an emotionally immature parent manifests as volatile, driven, passive, or rejecting, the final outcome for the child is tragically identical. They are fundamentally incapable of offering the reciprocal, attentive engagement that human development requires. The home remains a theater built entirely around the parent's defensive needs, leaving the child emotionally malnourished and unseen. Faced with such profound deprivation, a developing mind is forced to adapt, forging complex coping mechanisms and subconscious fantasies to survive the unbearable reality of their isolation. Chapter 5. How different children react to emotionally immature parenting. When caregivers possess an arrested emotional development that prevents them from providing adequate attention or genuine affection, their children are forced to invent complex psychological mechanisms to endure the deprivation. To cope with a parent's profound self-preoccupation, a child will instinctively generate a healing fantasy, a deeply held, subconscious story about how their unmet needs will eventually be satisfied in some distant, better future. Simultaneously, they will contrive a specific family role, fabricating what can be understood as a role self. This artificial persona is meticulously designed to extract whatever meager attention can be wrested from a deeply distracted caregiver. A child confronted with such emotional poverty inevitably concludes that their genuine, spontaneous nature is fundamentally insufficient to secure their parents' love. Consequently, they accept the tragic premise that they must become something entirely different in order to be noticed. The true self, the wellspring of the child's natural aptitudes and authentic feelings, is systematically silenced, subjugated by the unyielding mandate to prioritize the parent's fragile equilibrium. Although this true self survives beneath the psychological armor, it remains suffocated by family rules that enforce compliance over authenticity. This process begins because children inherently attempt to make sense of a confusing and painful world by authoring a narrative that explains their suffering. They imagine specific conditions that would finally alleviate their emotional loneliness, constructing a hopeful fantasy that life will be healed if only a particular change occurs. Every healing fantasy hinges on the phrase, "if only." A child might believe they would be cherished if only they were perfectly selfless, if only they achieved spectacular success, or if only they could eventually find a partner who anticipated their every need. Some even fantasize that cultivating an intimidating, powerful persona will protect them from further neglect. Because these fantasies are forged in the desperate mind of a child, they frequently fail to map onto the complexities of adult reality. Yet within the bleak landscape of a deprived childhood, this fantasy provides the vital optimism required to survive. It offers a promise of a better tomorrow, becoming the psychological lifeline that allows a child to endure chronic emotional starvation. As these children physically mature, they carry this subterranean fantasy into adulthood, secretly expecting their closest intimate relationships to fulfill the unmet promises of the past. Their subconscious demands upon their partners and friends are drawn directly from the nursery. They operate under the stubborn delusion that if they simply persist in their established patterns, they can eventually force other people to change and finally deliver the unconditional love they were denied. These unacknowledged expectations are profoundly self-defeating. A woman might exhaust herself trying to cure her father's chronic depression, mistakenly believing that his happiness is the mandatory prerequisite for her own freedom, entirely blind to the fact that her autonomy is already hers to claim. Another might dedicate herself to flawless subservience in her marriage, harboring a furious, unexpressed resentment when her husband fails to reward her compliance with the devotion she feels she has purchased. Because individuals are generally blind to their own healing fantasies, they subject their loved ones to constant, invisible tests of loyalty, setting traps that their partners inevitably fail. When a child's true self fails to elicit a secure response from a caregiver, the child instinctively pivots, testing different behaviors until they find a persona that secures a foothold in the family dynamic. This fabricated identity, the role self, gradually eclipses the spontaneous expression of the individual's true nature. A child might adopt the role of the tireless caretaker, operating under the assumption that relentless self-sacrifice will compel the family to value them. Alternatively, they might adopt a negative role, concluding that if they cannot be loved, they will at least command attention through defiance and chaos. This adaptation is entirely unconscious. It is a desperate process of trial and error dictated by the environment. As adults, individuals continue to faithfully execute this role, hoping it will eventually yield the authentic connection they crave. However, true intimacy cannot be forged from the hollow architecture of a role self. A genuine bond requires the vulnerability of the true self. Otherwise, the relationship is merely a theatrical performance between two artificial personas. Furthermore, sustaining a pseudo-self requires a massive, continuous theft of energy from the true self, leading to chronic exhaustion and a pervasive fear of being exposed as an imposter. The specific shape of this role self is heavily dictated by the parent's own unresolved psychological baggage. An insecure, anxious mother might actively cultivate her child's fearfulness, securing her own value by remaining the indispensable center of a terrified child's universe. A father plagued by secret inadequacy might systematically belittle his son, using the child's engineered failure to artificially inflate his own sense of competence. Parents rarely set out to intentionally cripple their children's development, but their powerful unconscious defenses compel them to project their own disowned flaws onto their offspring. If a child stumbles upon a role that perfectly assuages the parent's hidden anxiety, the child becomes locked in that identity. The child's authentic self fades into obscurity, traded for the illusion of belonging. To dismantle these deeply ingrained patterns, one must first deliberately unearth their specific healing fantasy and the mechanics of their role self. This requires a stark, honest appraisal of one's secret expectations. It demands acknowledging the hidden belief that others should behave in specific ways to provide validation and recognizing the exhausting performances enacted to secure approval. By comparing the spontaneous, joyful interests of one's early childhood, before the burden of the role was assumed, with the draining, obligatory behaviors of the present, the profound cost of this adaptation becomes glaringly apparent. Recognizing this disparity is the crucial first step toward relinquishing these outdated survival mechanisms and daring to express genuine individuality. While the specific details of these fantasies and roles are unique to each individual, children generally adopt one of two primary coping styles in response to emotionally immature parenting. They either internalize their distress or externalize it. Internalizers operate on the fundamental assumption that it is their responsibility to fix the problem by changing themselves, whereas externalizers firmly believe that the outside world must change to accommodate them. While a child might occasionally exhibit traits of both, they will inherently gravitate toward one dominant style based on their innate temperament and neurological wiring. The ultimate developmental goal is to achieve a balance between the two, where the internalizer learns to seek external support and the externalizer learns to cultivate internal accountability. Those who default to the internalizing style are characterized by an intense mental activity and a deep-seated desire to learn from their environment. They approach life's difficulties through self-reflection, attempting to solve problems from the inside out by carefully analyzing cause and effect. They view existence as a continuous opportunity for personal development and genuinely enjoy the process of becoming more competent. When confronted with a challenge, their instinct is to assume responsibility and work harder. Consequently, their primary psychological burdens are a profound guilt when they displease others and a haunting fear of being revealed as a fraud. In relationships, their greatest vulnerability is a tendency toward extreme self-sacrifice, which inevitably breeds a silent, toxic resentment when their efforts are not reciprocated. Conversely, externalizers are defined by reactivity. They take impulsive action to immediately discharge anxiety before engaging in any thoughtful analysis. They are virtually devoid of self-reflection, instinctively assigning the blame for their difficulties to other people or unfair circumstances. While they experience life through a cycle of trial and error, they rarely extract any meaningful lessons from their mistakes to guide their future behavior. They are anchored to the conviction that their happiness is entirely dependent upon the external world conforming to their demands. Their coping mechanisms are frequently so chaotic and destructive that they force other people to intervene and manage the fallout. They harbor a deep sense of entitlement, feeling that competent individuals owe them assistance, and often harbor a simmering resentment that life has been unfairly generous to others. Their self-image vacillates wildly between abysmal insecurity and an inflated, arrogant superiority. Because they rely entirely on external sources for soothing, they are highly susceptible to substance abuse, addictive relationships, and the relentless pursuit of immediate gratification. Their core terror is the prospect of being severed from the external sources that provide their stability. Understanding the externalizer's perspective is particularly crucial, given that the vast majority of emotionally immature parents utilize this exact coping style. While internalizers suffer a more conscious, private agony, their tendency to assume blame frequently elicits sympathy and support from others. Externalizers, however, behave in ways that alienate and infuriate those around them. Yet they will relentlessly escalate their acting out until someone is finally forced to step in and rescue them. Internalizers must recognize that externalizers fundamentally perceive reality as the enemy. They act like demanding young children who expect the universe to yield to their distress. Because externalizers expel stress the moment it arises, they forfeit the opportunity for psychological growth, remaining locked in a state of emotional immaturity. This reliance on externalization creates a devastating, self-perpetuating cycle of defeat. Unlike internalizers who quietly manage their pain, externalizers act it out, utilizing impulsive behaviors to momentarily distract themselves from their underlying distress. While this provides fleeting relief, it inevitably generates far more severe consequences. When forced to confront the fallout of their actions, they experience brief but agonizing flashes of shame. To protect their fragile ego from total collapse, they immediately deploy denial, aggressively shifting the blame to others rather than contemplating personal change. This strategy effectively repels the very emotional support they subconsciously crave, leaving them isolated and prone to further impulsive acting out. They exist in a state of perpetual dependency, constantly searching for an external power source to plug into, entirely lacking the internal batteries that internalizers possess. In family systems, this dynamic often leads to parents indulging an externalizing child. Dealing with the immediate chaos of a reactive child provides a convenient distraction for emotionally immature parents, allowing them to avoid their own unresolved psychological pain. They eagerly adopt the role of the strong, capable savior managing a hopelessly dependent child, thereby validating their own worth. This externalizing pathology exists on a broad continuum. At the most severe, malignant end are predatory, sociopathic individuals who view other human beings merely as resources to be exploited, possessing absolute indifference to the suffering they cause. Yet, there are also milder externalizers who may superficially appear passive or compliant, but give themselves away by their unyielding conviction that someone else is responsible for their happiness. A seemingly accommodating husband like Rodney might allow his wife to dictate every aspect of his life, presenting himself as a cooperative partner while secretly viewing himself as a chained prisoner, blaming her entirely for his lack of fulfillment. He refuses to take ownership of his own choices, waiting passively for his wife to spontaneously change and grant him the freedom he is too fearful to claim for himself. The presence of an externalizing child within a family creates a specific and agonizing dynamic for their internalizing siblings. Often, an aggressive, acting-out sibling becomes the tyrant of the household, freely inflicting their boredom and rage upon the quieter children while the parents utterly fail to intervene. Emotionally immature parents frequently view the externalizing child as somehow special or uniquely fragile, continuously excusing their destructive behavior. They will demand that the internalizing child suppress their own needs and endure the abuse to maintain the peace, prioritizing the volatile child's equilibrium over the quiet child's safety. The externalizer learns that they are immune to consequences, sometimes even weaponizing their victim status to falsely accuse others of abuse, secure in the knowledge that their parents will instinctively rush to protect them and maintain the established family roles. While these two coping styles represent distinct psychological profiles, human nature is rarely absolute. Under extreme duress, individuals can exhibit the behaviors of their opposite type. Through severe life crises, the destructive consequences of addiction, or the forced interventions of the legal system, externalizers can sometimes be pushed to hit rock bottom, finally developing the capacity for internal accountability and self-reflection. Conversely, internalizers pushed to the brink of emotional exhaustion may suddenly fracture, abandoning their responsible nature to act out through impulsive affairs, sudden abandonments of duty, or substance abuse. Like Ron, a lifelong internalizer crushed beneath the weight of a demanding boss and a self-involved mother, the pressure can become so unbearable that they seek the immediate externalizing escape of drugs or alcohol. A lifetime of chronic self-denial can culminate in a desperate externalizing grasp for immediate relief and vitality, a phenomenon often mischaracterized as a sudden midlife crisis, but which is actually the inevitable collapse of an unsustainable role. Ultimately, psychological health demands a synthesis of both capacities. While the externalizing style is generally more chaotic and less conducive to mature relationships, its inherent bias toward taking action can occasionally be a necessary strength. Yet, the extreme internalizer must learn to protect themselves from exhaustion by recognizing their limits and demanding external support. Balancing the instinct to look inward with the courage to reach outward is the essential task in overcoming the legacy of an emotionally barren childhood. Chapter 6. What it's like to be an internalizer. From their earliest days, highly perceptive children who default to an internalizing coping style intuitively register when a caregiver is emotionally absent. Because their nervous systems are uniquely wired to detect subtle emotional shifts, they experience the resulting loneliness with an acute, agonizing clarity that a less observant child might miss. Their profound sensitivity guarantees that the emotional vacuum of their childhood leaves a deep and lasting imprint on their psychological development. We must examine the specific mechanics of this internalizing nature, exploring how a desperate longing for authentic connection frequently drives these individuals to overextend themselves in relationships, ultimately risking profound self-neglect. If you recognize yourself as an internalizer, you have likely questioned why you are so exceptionally attuned to the hidden emotional currents of the people around you. This hyper-awareness is not merely a psychological quirk, it is rooted in your fundamental biology. Internalizers operate like human tuning forks, possessing nervous systems that automatically detect and resonate with the subtle emotional frequencies in their environment. This heightened receptivity is a double-edged sword, allowing them to absorb immense amounts of data, yet simultaneously leaving them vulnerable to becoming overwhelmed by the emotional atmosphere. Pioneering neurological research suggests that this profound attunement is present from infancy, with certain babies demonstrating a far greater capacity for sustained observation and physiological sensitivity than others. These innate neurological blueprints dictate how effectively an individual can self-soothe under stress, heavily influencing the coping mechanisms they will rely upon as they mature. Because internalizers instinctively hold their emotional reactions inside rather than immediately discharging them through impulsive behavior, their feelings have the time and space to magnify. Experiencing the world with such intensity, they are frequently labeled by others as being overly dramatic or excessively sensitive. When confronted with emotional pain, an internalizer's natural biological response is to display sadness or weep, the exact expressions of vulnerability that an emotionally phobic, immature parent finds most intolerable. In contrast, when an externalizing child experiences distress, they instantly act it out, leading adults to miscategorize their emotional pain as a mere behavioral infraction. While the externalizing child is disciplined for acting out, the internalizing child receives a far more devastating message that their innate sensitive nature is fundamentally flawed. The internalizer is subjected to shaming and contempt, absorbing the toxic belief that their very core is defective simply because they feel things deeply. Driven by this profound sensitivity, internalizers possess an absolute necessity for authentic emotional intimacy. Their entire psychological architecture craves spontaneous, reciprocal connection, rendering them incapable of settling for superficial bonds. Consequently, being raised by caregivers who are terrified of emotional depth condemns the internalizing child to an agonizing isolation. The central tragedy of their early existence is the desperate, unfulfilled hunger to share their inner world. Nothing extinguishes their spirit quite like the blank, unresponsive stare of a caregiver who refuses to engage. They constantly scan the faces of those around them, searching for the slightest flicker of mutual understanding. This is not a casual desire for pleasant socialization. It is a primal imperative to forge a profound, resonant link with another human mind. When this connection is denied, they are plunged into a devastating emotional loneliness. Developmental studies on secure attachment powerfully demonstrate this phenomenon, revealing how infants will rapidly disintegrate into profound distress if a mother suddenly presents an expressionless, unresponsive face. Faced with self-absorbed caregivers, internalizing children often conclude that their only hope for securing affection is to become flawlessly accommodating. They adopt the tragic misconception that by perfectly anticipating their parents' needs and entirely suppressing their own, they can finally purchase the love they crave. Yet, being utilized as a dependable utility is a hollow substitute for being genuinely cherished. No amount of perfect obedience can magically generate empathy within a fundamentally self-involved parent. The internalizing child remains entirely unaware that unconditional love is a free gift, not a commodity to be bought through relentless self-sacrifice. This agonizing dynamic was perfectly embodied by a professional musician who entered therapy radiating an intense, defensive anger, yet harboring a profound, underlying sorrow. Despite originating from a family that constantly advertised its supposed closeness and loyalty, she felt entirely alienated from them. Her desperate attempts to communicate her true self were consistently met with a chilling indifference. She felt as though she could be engulfed in flames, and her family would simply refuse to notice. As an internalizer, her spirit demanded authentic engagement, but her family was entirely populated by individuals rigidly committed to superficial roles and terrified of emotional depth. Her attempts to bridge the gap had repeatedly failed, leaving her exhausted and battling severe self-doubt, wondering if her fundamental need for connection meant she was somehow broken. She had spent a lifetime trying to elevate the moods of others, desperately hoping to be valued for her utility, while remaining completely unseen for who she truly was. This profound ache for connection is not a weakness. It is an evolutionary triumph. Humans, as mammals, possess a specific, highly evolved biological mechanism for managing stress that relies entirely on social proximity. Unlike reptiles, which are limited to the primitive, energy-draining responses of fighting, fleeing, or freezing, mammals can rapidly lower their heart rates and regulate their stress hormones simply by engaging in comforting physical or emotional contact with their group. This brilliant evolutionary adaptation allows mammals to conserve vital energy while simultaneously reinforcing the social bonds necessary for collective survival. When an internalizer aches for understanding, they are not displaying a pathological dependency. They are flawlessly executing a sophisticated biological survival instinct. It is the emotionally immature individual, terrified of intimacy, who is operating from a place of deficit, wrongly interpreting the natural human need for empathy as a shameful weakness. Driven by this healthy, undeniable instinct, internalizing children are remarkably resourceful at seeking out emotional sustenance beyond the barren landscape of their immediate family. Their acute perceptiveness allows them to identify safe, responsive individuals, perhaps a warm teacher, a compassionate neighbor, or an extended relative. They might also draw profound comfort from the unconditional affection of pets, or discover a sense of deep resonance and belonging through nature, art, or spiritual connection. While externalizing children also crave soothing, they attempt to extract it through chaotic demands, emotional manipulation, or coercion. Because the externalizer forces others to react, the resulting attention is always tinged with resentment and lacks the nourishing quality of freely given empathy. The tragic reality of the emotionally immature caregiver is that they generally operate as externalizers who possess absolutely no capacity to utilize emotional engagement as a calming mechanism. When threatened, they instantly revert to primitive fight-or-flight behaviors, deploying rigid defenses such as rage, criticism, or tyrannical control that actively repel the very connection that could soothe them. Because they cannot tolerate vulnerability, attempting to comfort an agitated externalizer is an exhausting, futile endeavor. They remain perpetually suspicious and rigidly closed off to genuine soothing. Yet, the ability to draw strength from intimate bonds is not merely a psychological luxury, it is frequently the deciding factor in actual physical survival. Studies of individuals who endure catastrophic, life-threatening ordeals consistently reveal that their primary source of resilience is the mental invocation of their loved ones. If the simple memory of connection can sustain a human being through absolute horror, its necessity for navigating ordinary daily stress is undeniable. Because internalizing children are frequently conditioned to view their emotional needs as a burdensome nuisance, they carry a profound sense of apology into adulthood whenever they require assistance. Upon entering a therapeutic setting, they habitually minimize their own suffering, dismissing their trauma as trivial and insisting that others are far more deserving of the professional's time. This self-depreciation is the direct legacy of a family system that reserved its attention exclusively for the loudest, most chaotic externalizing members. If an internalizer was punished for crying in childhood, they will arrive in an adult setting terrified of their own tears, preemptively apologizing for their distress and attempting to process their agony with total stoic isolation. When they finally encounter someone who offers genuine, undivided attention to their inner world, the experience is often profoundly shocking to them. Within the family ecosystem, the quiet, responsible nature of the internalizing child renders them dangerously easy to neglect. Caregivers instinctively funnel their limited energy toward the volatile, externalizing children who constantly demand intervention through their disruptive behavior. The internalizer, terrified of being a burden, handles their own difficulties silently, projecting an illusion of total self-sufficiency. Preoccupied parents misinterpret this quiet competence as a lack of need, readily leaving the child to navigate their development entirely alone. Yet, the ability to manage practically without supervision does not equate to thriving without emotional warmth. While internalizers can endure vast stretches of time on minimal affection by carefully hoarding their memories of positive connection, this emotional starvation diet takes a severe toll. They become pathetically grateful for even the smallest crumb of recognition, overwhelmed by a simple gesture of gratitude because they are so profoundly accustomed to receiving nothing in return for their constant emotional labor. Consequently, adults who survived this dynamic frequently fail to recognize that their childhood was defined by severe emotional neglect. They do not possess the vocabulary to articulate the void they experienced. They simply carry a pervasive, nameless sense of isolation. It is only upon deep reflection that memories surface of being left entirely unprotected in dangerous environments, or realizing that their parents displayed zero concern for their physical or emotional safety. They functioned as tiny, hypervigilant adults, assuming the crushing burden of their own protection. One individual vividly recalled being dispatched on a terrifying multi-day bus journey as a mere child, forced to suppress her own panic in order to protect an even younger sibling. Another was abandoned in a foreign country at the age of 10, expected to act as a full-time caretaker for an infant, while her own mother remained completely oblivious to the gross negligence of the situation. To survive this terrifying lack of sanctuary, internalizing children frequently develop a brutal, dismissive attitude toward their own internal suffering. They observe that their caregivers are irritated by their vulnerability and logically conclude that they must eradicate their own emotional needs to secure any form of connection. They adopt a flawlessly compliant persona, desperately asking themselves how they can make themselves enough, completely unaware that a child should never be tasked with earning their own security. When these caregivers do attempt to offer comfort, it is generally so shallow and generic that it provides absolutely no relief. The child learns early on that when true terror strikes, they are entirely, utterly alone. This ingrained isolation warps into a fierce, premature independence that society frequently praises, blinding the internalizer to the fact that their self-reliance was born of desperate necessity, not choice. They become convinced that depending on anyone is a fatal error, masking their profound vulnerability behind a wall of flawless competence. Furthermore, because their parents never acknowledged their own behavior as damaging, the internalizer rarely identifies their childhood experiences as abusive. They carry this blindness into adulthood, frequently tolerating severe mistreatment from romantic partners because they have been conditioned to normalize cruelty and instinctively blame themselves for any relational discord. They will excuse volatile tempers and terrifying outbursts, convinced that their own supposed flaws provoked the abuse. Because their caregivers abdicate their parental responsibilities, the internalizing child is forced to shoulder the vast majority of the emotional labor within the family. They become the hyper-vigilant monitors of the household mood, rushing to soothe escalating tensions and constantly anticipating the needs of unstable adults. If the family atmosphere is chronically depressed, the internalizer may adopt an exhausting, artificially cheerful persona, desperately attempting to inject vitality and joy into a lifeless environment. They function as the family's emotional shock absorbers. More tragically, they frequently become the designated confidant for their own parents, subjected to inappropriate adult burdens and forced to offer counseling to the very people who should be protecting them. This pattern of relentless emotional overwork inevitably bleeds into their adult relationships. Internalizers approach romantic partnerships with the hubristic subconscious belief that their infinite capacity for empathy can miraculously cure an emotionally stunted partner. They pour endless energy into barren relationships, assuming total responsibility for the couple's harmony and routinely inventing excuses for their partner's callousness. They operate under the delusion that their tireless accommodation will eventually awaken reciprocity in a partner who fundamentally lacks the capacity for it. This dynamic is practically inevitable, as deeply needy externalizers are magnetically drawn to the internalizer's boundless patience and warmth. The internalizer, conditioned to view their worth solely through their utility to others, readily accepts this parasitic arrangement, often extending their compulsive caretaking to complete strangers. They are driven by the toxic foundational lie that true goodness requires absolute self-erasure. They exhaust themselves trying to fix individuals who have absolutely no desire to change, eventually collapsing into a profound, isolated resentment when they realize that no amount of self-sacrifice will ever be enough to purchase the authentic love they have always deserved. Chapter 7. Breaking Down and Awakening. The concept of a profound, enduring inner essence traces its origins back to antiquity, frequently understood as the soul. It is the quiet, observing consciousness at the very center of a person's being, existing entirely apart from the artificial personas constructed for the outside world. This true self functions as an exquisitely accurate neurological compass, constantly pointing the individual toward optimal energy, deep fulfillment, and authentic flow. Like a thriving child, it inherently desires to expand, to be known, and to express its most sincere inclinations. When caregivers nurture this expansion, the individual remains seamlessly aligned with their inner truth. However, when parents utilize shame, criticism, or emotional withdrawal to enforce compliance, the child learns to view their spontaneous desires with profound embarrassment. They bury their true self, subjugating its wisdom to the desperate demands of a fabricated role designed to purchase parental approval. Because the true self fundamentally seeks alignment with reality, it eventually rebels against the exhausting fiction of the role self. This rebellion frequently manifests as an emotional or physical breakdown. Debilitating symptoms such as chronic anxiety, insomnia, heavy depression, or sudden panic are not signs of inherent defectiveness. They are urgent distress signals broadcast by the true self, demanding an immediate cessation of self-betrayal. Recognizing this requires a brutal, honest reflection upon the person one was before the burden of societal and familial expectations took hold. Perhaps the spontaneous, joyful child who existed before the relentless inner critic took over. When one contrasts that unburdened essence with the exhausting, energy-depleting reality of their current obligations and artificial performances, the monumental cost of the role self becomes undeniable. A psychological breakdown is rarely the fracturing of the actual self. Rather, it is the spectacular collapse of an unsustainable lie. It is the agonizing but necessary shattering of the denial required to tolerate an emotionally barren reality. As pioneer developmental psychologists have long observed, the acquisition of new, profound knowledge demands that old, rigid mental structures break apart to accommodate the truth. This period of intense emotional distress is frequently a harbinger of massive psychological growth, a phenomenon aptly termed positive disintegration. Individuals possessing high developmental potential utilize these periods of upheaval not as reasons to retreat into defensiveness, but as crucibles for forging a more complex, autonomous identity. This transformative suffering was evident in the life of a highly perceptive woman who entered therapy following a catastrophic romantic entanglement. Because of her deep desire to scrutinize her own history and understand her emotional pain, her rigidly conformist family quickly labeled her as the sick one, mocking her psychological exploration as a self-indulgent waste of time. However, when she was introduced to the concept that her profound distress was actually the engine of her psychological evolution, she was liberated. She realized that her agony was not a symptom of illness, but the agonizing birth pangs of a stronger, more authentic identity, distinguishing her as the only member of her family courageous enough to evolve. Breaking free from an obsolete role often requires the true self to deploy dramatic physiological interventions. For one woman, this wake-up call arrived in the form of terrifying, unpredictable panic attacks triggered by the presence of her domineering, highly critical older brother. Throughout her life, she had navigated social interactions as an exhausting triathlon of hypervigilance, terrified of causing offense and perpetually assuming she was at fault if anyone, particularly a male authority figure, expressed displeasure. Her brother had simply assumed the throne vacated by their deceased, tyrannical father. Her sudden panic was her true self's explosive refusal to continue playing the submissive, inadequate little girl to the arrogant, omnipotent male. As she analyzed the source of her terror, the pedestal she had built for her brother crumbled, allowing her to finally experience her own sovereign individuality. Shattering a childhood healing fantasy frequently demands confronting deeply buried, culturally taboo emotions. Individuals conditioned to view themselves as perpetual caregivers often harbor massive reservoirs of guilt regarding any negative feelings toward their parents. Yet suffocating these authentic emotions breeds a heavy, paralyzing depression. Consider a young woman who owed her entire existence and extensive education to the relentless, back-breaking labor of her immigrant mother. As the daughter approached the pinnacle of her career, her mother grew increasingly bitter, subjecting her to endless, draining telephone calls filled with complaints and vitriol. The daughter felt utterly crushed by guilt, convinced she was a monstrous child for feeling burdened by the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. When a therapist gently pushed her to identify the physical sensation these calls provoked, the daughter practically whispered a terrifying truth. She fundamentally did not like her mother. Admitting this dark reality did not diminish her profound gratitude, but it instantly lifted her depression. She was freed from the impossible mandate of manufacturing an artificial emotional warmth that simply did not exist. Anger, in particular, is a vital instrument of individuation, functioning as the biological alarm system against emotional exploitation. Emotionally immature parents systematically pathologize this emotion, punishing any display of defiance to maintain their own comfort. Consequently, their children grow into adults who view their own irritation as a character flaw. One such woman spent years berating herself for the simmering rage she felt toward her distant, unengaged family, constantly attempting to view them through a lens of artificial forgiveness. When she finally accepted that her anger was the precise correct response to decades of profound emotional neglect, she felt an immense surge of empowerment. Her fury burned away the naive, desperately held illusion that her family possessed a hidden capacity for deep love, allowing her to stop pouring her energy into a void and begin trusting her own compass. This awakening inevitably extends to the realm of self-care, an area where internalizers are notoriously deficient. Conditioned to believe their worth is entirely dependent upon their relentless productivity and service to others, they systematically ignore their own physical limits. A highly driven professional woman lived her life entirely at the mercy of internal and external demands, treating even her hobbies as grueling tests of endurance. Her awakening arrived only after she pushed herself so brutally in a fitness class that she was physically incapable of climbing a flight of stairs the next day. The agonizing soreness forced her to recognize the tyrannical, internalized voice of her mother, a woman who had constantly equated rest with shameful laziness. By exposing this toxic conditioning, the woman learned the revolutionary act of pausing before a task to explicitly ask herself if she actually wanted to do it, finally prioritizing her own physiological needs over a phantom master. Intimate partnerships are frequently the ultimate arena for this profound awakening, as they relentlessly trigger unresolved childhood hungers. One man, after enduring a soul-crushing divorce that left him financially ruined, found himself inexplicably euphoric. He had spent 35 years executing a flawless performance of the dutiful provider, subjugating his every desire to appease a perpetually dissatisfied wife and an overbearing mother. The total collapse of his external success was the precise mechanism that liberated him from his lifelong emotional prison. Stripped of the facade, he was finally free to discover the man beneath the obligations. Similarly, breaking free requires dismantling the dangerous habit of falsely idealizing others. Children instinctively inflate their parents' wisdom to feel protected, but carrying this manufactured reverence into adulthood paralyzes growth. A woman who lived with her impulsive husband and petulant mother forcefully rejected the suggestion that she was the most mature adult in her household, viewing such an assessment as horribly arrogant. This false humility was a defensive strategy designed to avoid the terrifying reality of her loved one's profound limitations. Once she surrendered the fantasy and accepted her own superior emotional fortitude, she was able to establish firm boundaries, no longer pretending to be small so that the fragile egos around her could feel large. This journey demands that the individual fiercely claim their own strengths and talents. Emotionally starved children are rarely mirrored by their caregivers, leaving them deeply uncomfortable with self-promotion or pride. They must deliberately inventory their assets, allowing themselves to feel genuine satisfaction in their capabilities. This self-affirmation frequently requires the conscious adoption of an entirely new set of operating values. A talented stoic man had spent his life adhering to a silent code of modesty, hoping his brilliance would naturally draw the recognition he craved. When he realized that this passive strategy only invited exploitation, he consciously discarded it. He began aggressively advocating for his own career, finally deeming himself a worthy investment. Ultimately, waking up means willingly walking into the fire of unresolved childhood grief. It is the arduous, necessary labor of taking the raw, terrifying fragments of early trauma and patiently processing them until they can be integrated into a cohesive life narrative. The capacity to form secure, profound bonds in the present is inextricably linked to one's willingness to unflinchingly examine the darkness of the past. By enduring the painful dismantling of their defensive illusions, the awakened individual secures the ultimate prize, an existence anchored firmly in reality, guided by the infallible wisdom of the true self. Chapter 8. How to avoid getting hooked by an emotionally immature parent. The most enduring trap for the adult child of an emotionally restricted caregiver is the persistent, heartbreaking illusion that the parent is on the verge of a miraculous transformation. This deep-seated fantasy whispers that if the adult child can just find the perfect sequence of words, achieve the right level of success, or demonstrate an infinite capacity for patience, the parent's defensive armor will finally crack, revealing a wellspring of latent, unconditional love. This hope is an agonizing tether that keeps the individual continually returning to a barren well, desperately expecting it to yield water. Operating under this illusion guarantees a cycle of perpetual re-injury, because every interaction is approached with an expectation that the emotionally immature parent is fundamentally incapable of meeting. The tragedy is not just the parent's limitation, but the adult child's refusal to accept that limitation as an absolute, unchangeable reality. Consider the painful, repetitive cycle endured by a woman named Annie. Despite being a highly capable adult, every telephone call with her mother ended in tears of profound frustration. Annie continually approached her mother with genuine vulnerability, seeking the comforting maternal sounding board she desperately craved. She would offer up her authentic struggles and triumphs, subconsciously waiting for the warmth of parental validation. Instead, her mother would inevitably pivot the conversation to her own trivial grievances, offer chillingly dismissive advice, or launch into unprovoked petty criticisms of Annie's lifestyle. Annie's devastation was renewed with every encounter precisely because she was interacting with a phantom, the mother she wished existed, rather than the profoundly self-involved woman who was actually on the other end of the line. The emotional hook was Annie's own unyielding fantasy of an eventual magical rescue. To dismantle this agonizing cycle, one must adopt a radically different psychological posture, the stance of the objective observer. This requires a deliberate, conscious uncoupling from emotional reactivity. Instead of entering familial interactions as a vulnerable participant desperately seeking connection, one must learn to view the parent almost as a subject of anthropological study. When the parent begins to display their characteristic rigidity, egocentrism, or emotional volatility, the observing mind steps back, mentally noting these behaviors as fascinating, predictable data points of arrested development. This cognitive distance acts as an impenetrable shield. When an emotionally immature parent attempts to provoke guilt or demands center stage, the objective observer does not feel the sting of personal rejection. They simply recognize the behavior as the primitive defense mechanism it is. The parent ceases to be an omnipotent figure capable of inflicting deep wounds and is revealed instead as a profoundly limited individual operating from a place of chronic, unexamined fear. This shift in perspective brings a crucial distinction into sharp focus: the vast chasm between true relationship and mere relatedness. A genuine relationship requires reciprocal emotional labor. It is a dynamic, breathing entity built upon mutual empathy, a willingness to engage in self-reflection, and a shared commitment to resolving conflict and deepening intimacy. It demands that both parties possess a sovereign inner life and respect the boundaries of the other. Relatedness, however, is a superficial state of existence based entirely on obligation, biological ties, and the rigid performance of assigned family roles. Emotionally immature parents are generally only capable of relatedness. They demand the outward rituals of familial devotion without possessing the internal architecture required to sustain actual emotional closeness. Clinging to the demand for a relationship with someone who is only equipped for relatedness is the source of endless, exhausting suffering. True freedom begins the moment one accepts the precise, limited nature of what is actually possible. Navigating this limited terrain requires the implementation of a deliberate strategy, a method of interacting that protects the self while managing the reality of the parent's deficits. This is the maturity awareness approach. It is not a tool for changing the parent, but a comprehensive system for managing one's own expectations and emotional energy. When utilizing this approach, the adult child enters the interaction anchored firmly in their own reality, fully anticipating the parent's predictable behaviors. Communication is kept polite, clear, and intentionally surface level. One does not offer up vulnerable emotional truths to an individual proven incapable of handling them. When the parent attempts to initiate a toxic role reversal or boundary violation, the adult child gracefully but firmly disengages, perhaps by steering the conversation to a neutral topic or simply ending the interaction. It is a mastery of presence without entanglement, allowing one to interact with the family system without being swallowed by it. Returning to Annie's journey, the implementation of this approach completely altered the landscape of her life. She stopped calling her mother when she felt sad or needed guidance, recognizing that asking a self-preoccupied parent for empathy was like asking a stone for warmth. Instead, she reserved those conversations for her emotionally mature friends and partner. When she did interact with her mother, Annie focused entirely on managing the time and keeping the topics light. When her mother inevitably launched into a critique, Annie no longer felt the crushing weight of a child being scolded. She observed the behavior, mentally acknowledged it as a symptom of her mother's immaturity, and calmly changed the subject. The profound result was not a sudden blossoming of maternal love, but something far more valuable: absolute internal peace. Annie was no longer devastated by her mother's limitations because she had entirely ceased demanding that her mother be someone else. The final, essential phase of avoiding the emotional hook is the conscious, deliberate act of stepping out of the old role self. This artificial persona, forged in the fires of childhood to appease the parent and survive the emotional vacuum, is a heavy armor that prevents the individual from inhabiting their true life. As long as one continues to play the assigned family role, whether it be the tireless caretaker, the scapegoat, or the perfect achiever, they remain fundamentally tethered to the parent's pathology. Abandoning this role requires immense courage, as it often triggers extreme discomfort and the furious pushback of a family system desperate to maintain its toxic equilibrium. This courageous departure was the defining triumph in the life of a woman named Rochelle. From her earliest memories, Rochelle had served as the family shock absorber, the designated peacemaker who instinctively rushed to intervene whenever her volatile parents began to escalate. Her entire identity was woven around this exhausting, impossible responsibility. As an adult, she realized that this role was actively destroying her own emotional health. The ultimate test arrived during a family gathering when her parents initiated a familiar, explosive argument. Every fiber of Rochelle's conditioned being screamed at her to step in, to soothe the tension and restore the artificial peace. Instead, she anchored herself in the present moment, recognized the urge as a phantom reflex of her childhood survival strategy, and physically left the room. She allowed her parents to experience the unfiltered consequences of their own chaos. Enduring the intense anxiety of not intervening was excruciating, but it was the necessary pain of true emancipation. By refusing to perform her outdated role, Rochelle definitively severed the invisible thread that had kept her bound to their immaturity, stepping fully into the sovereignty of her own autonomous existence. Chapter 9. How it feels to live free of roles and fantasies. Stepping out of the shadow of an emotionally immature caregiver is akin to waking up in a completely new psychological landscape. When the heavy, suffocating armor of the fabricated role self is finally discarded and the desperate, lifelong healing fantasy is put to rest, the individual is introduced to a startlingly quiet and spacious internal world. For decades, the invisible gravity of ingrained family patterns dictated every choice, reaction, and boundary. These covert rules were never designed to foster psychological growth or personal fulfillment. They were meticulously engineered to maintain the fragile equilibrium of deeply insecure caregivers. In such systems, the emergence of genuine individuality is not celebrated but perceived as a profound threat. Any display of independent thought, unique preference, or deviation from the assigned script is routinely met with swift, punishing discouragement. The child is systematically conditioned to believe that blending in and anticipating the needs of others are the only acceptable methods of survival. Recognizing how thoroughly these patterns have infiltrated adult relationships is the crucial awakening that precedes true autonomy. Even when vast physical distance is achieved, the ghost of the limited caregiver often remains securely lodged within the mind. This internalized parental voice operates as a relentless, harsh inner critic, constantly whispering demands for perfection, questioning motives, and predicting catastrophic failure if any independent step is taken. It is the echo of a parent who could only control their environment by making their child feel perpetually inadequate. True emancipation requires isolating this hostile, internalized frequency and deliberately choosing to mute it. By recognizing that this inner cruelty is an adopted script rather than an objective truth, the individual can begin to replace it with a voice of self-compassion and realistic self-appraisal. This liberation is deeply anchored in the radical acceptance of one's own fallibility. The crushing mandate to be absolutely flawless, a desperate survival tactic learned in a home where the slightest mistake was met with terrifying emotional withdrawal or explosive rage, is finally replaced by the profound freedom to simply be human and wonderfully imperfect. Without the constant threat of a caregiver's devastating judgment, errors lose their apocalyptic weight. They become normal, manageable aspects of human learning rather than indictments of one's fundamental worth. Consider the profound shift experienced by a man named Jason, who had spent his entire adult life paralyzed by an agonizing perfectionism. Raised by a father who relentlessly scrutinized his every action, demanding impossible standards of excellence just to acknowledge Jason's existence, Jason carried this suffocating pressure into his career and marriage. He lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion, convinced that a single misstep would result in total abandonment. When he finally engaged in the deep work of dismantling his childhood conditioning, he recognized that his relentless drive was not genuine ambition, but a traumatized reflex, a shield against his father's anticipated contempt. The moment Jason permitted himself to deliver a project that was merely good enough rather than flawless, the world did not end. The sky did not fall. He discovered that the terrifying consequences he had spent a lifetime avoiding were entirely imaginary. Embracing his imperfections allowed him to finally experience joy in his work and authentic relaxation in his home, shedding a burden he was never meant to carry. With the inner critic silenced and the terror of imperfection neutralized, the individual inherits the absolute freedom to possess their own genuine thoughts and emotions. There is no longer a frantic need to immediately filter reactions or twist internal realities to ensure they are palatable to a volatile family system. If an interaction feels draining, the individual can simply acknowledge that fatigue without layering it in guilt. If they disagree with a prevalent opinion, they can hold their own perspective securely without the panic of anticipated punishment. This is the birth of true emotional sovereignty, the unshakable conviction that one's internal world belongs entirely to oneself. This newfound emotional grounding naturally breeds a powerful, exhilarating sense of agency. The individual discovers the freedom to take decisive action entirely on their own behalf. They are no longer waiting for parental permission or agonizing over whether a personal choice will disrupt the delicate, artificial peace of the family ecosystem. They can pursue careers that actually resonate with their true self, establish friendships based on mutual respect rather than trauma bonding, and fiercely defend their personal boundaries without the slightest need for apology. Taking action becomes a joyful expression of vitality rather than a fearful calculation of risk. Ultimately, the most profound and unexpected peace arrives with the astonishing freedom to simply not want anything from the parent anymore. The agonizing, lifelong vigil at the empty well is finally abandoned. The individual no longer aches for an apology that will never come, nor do they wait for a sudden dawn of parental empathy that the caregiver is fundamentally unequipped to provide. the desperate, exhausting work of trying to translate their soul into a language the parent can understand ceases entirely. By grieving the relationship they deserved but never received, they release the parent to their own limitations. This surrender is not a defeat, it is the ultimate victory. It marks the precise moment when the individual reclaims all the vital energy previously wasted on a phantom hope, redirecting it entirely into the vibrant, undeniable reality of their own authentic life. Chapter 10. How to identify emotionally mature people. Reclaiming emotional sovereignty by honoring the true self, establishing firm boundaries, and acting independently sets the stage for a profoundly different relational landscape. The crucial next step in this evolution is cultivating the ability to accurately identify individuals who possess the emotional maturity required to sustain a mutually satisfying reciprocal connection. For many who survived an emotionally barren childhood, the very concept of a genuinely rewarding relationship feels like a naive pipe dream. They harbor a deep subterranean skepticism that anyone could be truly interested in their authentic self, fearing that any attempt at connection will inevitably result in the familiar ache of emotional loneliness. These negative expectations act as self-fulfilling prophecies, but they can be dismantled through conscious awareness and deliberate choices. The most insidious obstacle in this process is the powerful gravitational pull of old psychological patterns. Because the primitive architecture of the human brain equates familiarity with safety, those raised by self-involved caregivers are frequently subconsciously drawn to similarly egocentric and exploitative individuals in adulthood. Many individuals find that they are inherently bored by considerate, stable partners, experiencing a spark of attraction only when a prospective mate exhibits selfish or domineering traits. This electric sense of chemistry is often mistaken for genuine passion, when in reality it is the shivering anxiety of a childhood trauma being reactivated. The individuals we find most instantly charismatic are frequently the exact people who will perfectly recreate our most agonizing family dynamics. Breaking this cycle requires utilizing newfound observational skills to actively override these subconscious impulses and consciously select partners based on objective markers of emotional health. Recognizing these mature individuals requires a deliberate shift in focus. Instead of being swept away by familiar, chaotic intensity, one must look for the quiet, steady markers of emotional stability. These individuals possess a foundational soundness that makes relationships feel effortless, much like living in a flawlessly designed home where the architecture perfectly supports daily life. At their core, these individuals are deeply realistic and fundamentally reliable. When confronted with difficulties, they work with reality rather than launching into a futile war against it. They do not throw tantrums or demand that the universe conform to their immediate desires. Instead, they acknowledge the situation as it exists and actively seek practical solutions. Even when highly stressed or frustrated, they retain the crucial ability to feel and think simultaneously. They do not lose their capacity to understand another person's perspective simply because they are upset. Nor do they abandon logic when processing emotional pain. Because they possess a highly integrated, cohesive sense of self, their behavior remains remarkably consistent across different environments. They are the same person in public as they are in private, making them trustworthy custodians of another person's vulnerability. Furthermore, they navigate life without taking everything personally. Because they are not crippled by hidden insecurities or rigid perfectionism, they can accept their own mistakes and the mistakes of others with grace and humor, understanding that a minor social misstep is just an error, not a malicious attack. A stark illustration of the necessity for this kind of safety is seen in the experience of a woman named Ellen. She repeatedly attempted to share the details of her day with her boyfriend, only to find him using her stories merely as a springboard to launch into monologues about his own life. When she finally gathered the courage to ask him for more empathy and active listening, his reaction was disastrous. Because he lacked a secure sense of self, he interpreted her legitimate emotional request as a devastating attack on his character. He instantly became defensive and hostile, accusing her of not being perfect either. His profound lack of empathy made it impossible to navigate even the mildest conflict safely, proving that without mutual responsiveness, a relationship remains a minefield. When you encounter someone who possesses genuine maturity, they have a profound capacity to make you feel deeply seen and thoroughly understood. They exhibit a sincere, unforced curiosity about your inner world, actively remembering the details of your history and referencing them in future conversations. They do not demand that you mirror their opinions. Instead, they are fascinated by your individuality. In their presence, you find yourself naturally opening up, sharing personal truths you normally keep hidden, because their attentive engagement makes it entirely safe to do so. These individuals inherently like to comfort and be comforted. Their biological instinct for emotional engagement operates flawlessly. When you are distressed, they do not pull away or attempt to micromanage your feelings. They offer comfort freely and accept it just as naturally when they are in need. Crucially, they possess the courage to reflect on their own actions and genuinely try to change. If you express discomfort with their behavior, they do not launch into defensive tirades or offer hollow, superficial apologies. They take the feedback seriously, process it, and demonstrate follow-through by altering their actions. This requirement for self-reflection was the breaking point in the life of a woman named Jill. For years, she desperately tried to get her husband to acknowledge how his dismissive behavior impacted her. Every attempt at intimate communication was met with a furious counterattack, with him insisting she was simply impossible to please. His absolute refusal to look inward eventually destroyed the marriage. When Jill later found a new partner, she was astonished to discover a man who actually listened to her concerns, reconsidered his own behavior, and actively worked to adjust his actions to protect their bond. Evaluating the maturity of others can become a conscious practice, a mental checklist utilized when navigating new friendships or romantic prospects. It involves observing whether a person respects your boundaries without viewing them as an insult, whether they compromise fairly without demanding a sacrifice, and whether they can handle disappointment without resorting to punitive, prolonged silent treatments. It requires noting if they are truthful in difficult moments and if they are genuinely willing to be influenced by your perspective. Cultivating these new relationship habits also demands an unflinching examination of one's own behavior, ensuring that the legacy of a deprived childhood is not sabotaging the present. This means actively sustaining and appreciating emotional connections by permitting yourself to trust those who have proven themselves reliable. It requires abandoning the hyper-vigilant, solitary survival tactics of the past and embracing the vulnerability of interdependence. It also necessitates having reasonable expectations for oneself. The crushing, internalized mandate to be a flawless, endlessly accommodating savior must be discarded. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to set limits. You are allowed to disappoint people if accommodating them means betraying your own needs. Finally, securing these profound connections requires communicating clearly and actively seeking the outcomes you want. It means abandoning the childish fantasy that true love requires a partner to read your mind. If you want something, you must ask for it directly as many times as necessary without apologizing for your needs. It means assuming that your feelings are valid and trusting that an emotionally mature partner will actively desire to meet them. By deliberately putting these principles into practice, the agonizing cycle of emotional starvation is broken, replaced by the vibrant, deeply nourishing reality of genuine human intimacy.